It was a bright, sunny afternoon in London, and the city was buzzing with tourists from all over the world. Among them was Jack, a young man in his mid-twenties who had recently arrived from America. He was visiting the iconic landmarks of the city with a group of his friends, and today they had decided to see the famous Buckingham Palace. Jack had heard about the Royal Guards, those serious-looking soldiers dressed in their iconic red uniforms and black bearskin hats, standing still outside the palace, guarding the gates. They were known for their unwavering discipline and calmness. Jack thought they looked almost like statues, standing perfectly still, no matter what was happening around them. As Jack and his friends walked past the palace, they couldn't help but laugh at how stern the guards looked. They joked among themselves, making silly faces and trying to get the guards to smile. But of course, the guards didn't budge. They were as stoic as ever, and the group found that both funny and impressive. That's when Jack got an idea. His eyes sparkled with mischief, and a smile spread across his face. What if we made one of them move? He thought, grinning. He didn't mean anything bad by it. It was just a fun idea, a prank that would get everyone laughing. "Hey, why don't we splash water on one of them?" Jack said, his voice filled with excitement. His friends turned to him, eyebrows raised. They weren't sure what to think at first, but Jack was already starting to laugh, his playful nature shining through. "Are you serious?" one of his friends, Sarah, asked, glancing at the guards. "They're not going to like that." "Oh, come on, they're just standing there," Jack replied. "It's harmless. Let's see if we can get a reaction. It'll be hilarious." His friends hesitated, but Jack's enthusiasm was hard to resist. They watched as he pulled out a water bottle from his backpack. He took a big gulp from it before holding it up and staring at the nearest royal guard. The guard stood as still as ever, his eyes focused straight ahead, showing no signs of noticing the tourists around him. Jack's friends giggled nervously. They didn't know what to expect, but the idea of splashing the guard with water felt both thrilling and a little dangerous. "Go on, Jack. Just do it," one of his friends whispered. With a quick glance around to make sure no one was watching too closely, Jack tiptoed up behind the guard, ready to make his move. His heart raced with excitement, and a mischievous grin spread across his face. He couldn't wait to see the guard's reaction when the water hit him. In the middle of this excitement, Jack didn't stop to think about the consequences. He didn't realize how much respect the guards commanded or how serious their roles were. All that mattered to him in that moment was getting a good laugh. With a quick motion, Jack splashed the water onto the Royal Guard's uniform. He laughed loudly, expecting the guard to flinch, look surprised, or even scold him. But what happened next was far from what Jack had imagined. The group waited for the reaction, but instead of the expected shock or amusement, something completely different happened. The Royal Guard stood motionless, his face expressionless, but his body seemed to tense up. Jack's laughter faded as he realized that maybe this prank wasn't as funny as he had thought. The guard didn't budge, but Jack could see his posture stiffen, and an intense silence filled the air. It was a moment of tension, and no one, not even Jack, could have predicted what would happen next. Jack stood there, watching as the water from his bottle splashed onto the Royal Guard's uniform. For a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze. The laughter from his friends slowly died down, replaced by an eerie silence. Jack couldn't believe what he had just done. He had expected the guard to react, maybe step back in surprise or give them a stern look. But the guard didn't even flinch. He stood tall and still, like a statue. Jack's friends started to look around nervously. They could see that this wasn't going the way they had imagined. Sarah, one of Jack's closest friends, looked at him with wide eyes. "Jack, I don't think this was a good idea," she whispered, her voice full of concern. But Jack, still caught up in the excitement, shrugged it off. "It's fine," he said, trying to sound casual. "He's just a guard, right? He's supposed to stand still." However, the more Jack looked at the guard, the more he began to feel a strange sense of unease. The guard's rigid posture and unwavering focus were intimidating. The air seemed to grow heavier, and Jack started to question whether this prank was truly harmless. His heart began to race, and a small knot formed in his stomach. He had crossed a line, and now he wasn't sure what to expect. The guard still hadn't moved, and Jack wondered if the guard was waiting for him to do something else. His friends, on the other hand, were growing uncomfortable. "Jack, maybe we should go," Sarah urged, taking a step back. "We don't want any trouble." But Jack didn't want to back down. His pride got the better of him, and he decided to stand his ground. He couldn't just walk away after doing something so bold. "Let's just see what happens," he muttered, trying to sound confident. He didn't want to be the one to look scared. Still, Jack's mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do next. The guard hadn't said a word, but something about his presence was overwhelming. Jack took a deep breath, thinking about what his next move should be. Should he apologize? Should he try to act like nothing had happened? Or should he face whatever consequences the guard might have in store for him? Meanwhile, Jack's friends started to whisper among themselves, unsure of what to do. Some of them were still giggling, thinking the situation could still turn into a funny story. But others felt uneasy. It was clear that Jack's harmless prank wasn't so harmless after all. The tension in the air was thick, and Jack could feel it weighing on him. Just as Jack was about to say something, he noticed the guard's eyes shift ever so slightly toward him. Jack's heart skipped a beat. The moment felt like it was stretching on forever. The guard's gaze was sharp and focused, and it was like he could see straight through Jack. Suddenly, the guard took a small step forward, his boots making a soft click against the pavement. Jack's stomach dropped, and his friends fell silent. It was clear now that this was no longer a joke. The royal guard wasn't playing along. The group watched, holding their breath, as the guard's stern presence grew stronger. Jack felt a rush of guilt and fear flood over him. He realized that this wasn't just a harmless prank anymore. It was serious. The guard's presence was commanding, and the energy in the air had shifted dramatically. Jack knew he had to face whatever came next, but he wasn't prepared for what was to come. The suspense in the air was unbearable, and he could feel his palms start to sweat. The guard had finally made his move, and Jack's world seemed to come to a halt. The royal guard took another step forward, his boots clicking against the pavement with each movement. Jack's heart was pounding in his chest as the guard's gaze locked onto him. The group of friends stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. Jack had never expected the guard to respond like this. For a moment, everything seemed to blur around him as he tried to process what was happening. The guard's eyes were cold, focused, and unwavering. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He had crossed a line, and now he was facing the consequences. His friends were still standing behind him, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. They had all thought it would be a harmless joke, but now things were clearly much more serious than they had imagined. Jack glanced around quickly, hoping to find some way out of the situation. But there was nowhere to run. The group was surrounded by tourists, all eyes seemingly on them. The laughter that had filled the air moments ago was replaced by silence, and the only sound was the soft click of the guard's boots. For a moment, Jack's mind raced. Should he apologize? Should he try to explain that it was just a joke? But before he could say anything, the guard's voice broke through the silence. "Do you find this funny?" the guard asked, his tone steady but filled with authority. Jack's stomach twisted into knots. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His throat felt dry, and he couldn't find the right thing to say. He had never imagined this would happen. All he wanted was to make his friends laugh, but now he felt like the joke was on him. His friends stood behind him, too scared to speak. They exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to handle the situation. Sarah, who had been the most hesitant about the prank in the first place, now looked deeply uncomfortable. "Jack, maybe we should just apologize," she whispered, stepping forward slightly. This was a mistake. But Jack, still not ready to admit defeat, shook his head. "It's fine," he muttered under his breath. But it wasn't fine. Jack could feel the tension building around him. The guard was not amused, and his presence was intimidating. The group of friends now realized that they had misjudged the situation, and it wasn't funny anymore. They had expected a harmless prank, but what they had done was more than that. It was disrespectful. The guard's eyes never left Jack, and he stepped even closer, his posture rigid and commanding. Jack felt a sense of dread wash over him. He had always thought the royal guards were just statues, silent and still. But now, standing face to face with one of them, he realized just how wrong he had been. These guards weren't to be taken lightly. They had a purpose, and their role was far more important than Jack had ever understood. The guard's voice cut through the silence again, this time firmer. "You will learn to respect the uniform and the position I hold," he said. His words were calm, but they carried a weight that Jack couldn't ignore. Jack's face turned red with embarrassment. His friends were no longer laughing. The laughter had faded into the distance, and in its place, an uncomfortable quiet had taken over. Jack realized that this moment was more than just a prank gone wrong. It was a lesson in respect and understanding. The guard's words echoed in Jack's mind, and he finally found his voice. "I'm sorry," he said, his words sincere, though they felt small compared to the intensity of the situation. But the guard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply stood there, watching Jack, as if waiting for him to understand the gravity of the situation. The guard continued to stand tall, his posture rigid, his eyes locked on Jack. There was no sign of anger on his face, but his presence was enough to make Jack feel small. The air around them seemed heavier, like the atmosphere itself was waiting for something to happen. Jack's friends stood behind him, still silent, watching as the guard's gaze never wavered. No one knew what to expect next. Jack felt his palms begin to sweat. He had never been in a situation like this before. What had started as a harmless prank was now turning into something much more serious. He tried to find the right words, but nothing seemed good enough. What could he say? How could he explain himself? "I'm sorry," Jack repeated, his voice a little shakier this time. He was trying to sound sincere, but the more he spoke, the more he realized that just saying sorry wasn't enough. The guard was not going to just let this slide. There was something deeper here, something that Jack had failed to understand. The royal guard took a step closer, his boots clicking sharply against the stone pavement. The sound was sharp, deliberate. It made Jack's heart beat faster, and the feeling of unease grew even stronger. "You think this is a joke?" the guard asked again, his voice steady but full of authority. "You think that I am just standing here for your amusement?" Jack swallowed hard. He could feel his face getting hot, and his stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't how he had imagined this moment would go. He had thought it would be funny, a harmless prank to share with his friends. But now he was facing the reality of his actions. "No, I didn't mean to disrespect you," Jack said quickly, his voice almost a whisper now. "I didn't mean to make fun of you. I just thought it would be funny." The guard did not immediately respond. Instead, he took a moment, looking at Jack with an unwavering gaze, as if weighing his words. The silence between them felt like an eternity. Jack's friends exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one dared to speak. They were all waiting to see what the guard would do next. Finally, the guard spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You are standing in front of me, wearing the uniform of a soldier who serves the crown and the people. You are not the first person to think of playing a prank on me. But I assure you, it is never funny. It is disrespectful." Jack could feel the weight of the guard's words. He had not only disrespected the guard, but also the role he held. Jack had never considered how important this uniform and position were before. He had assumed the guards were just part of the scenery, something to take pictures of and laugh at. But now he saw the mistake he had made. "I understand now," Jack said quietly, the realization dawning on him. He felt ashamed of his actions and wished he could take them back. He wasn't sure if the guard would accept his apology, but it was all he could offer. The guard nodded once, as if accepting Jack's apology, but his expression remained serious. "Respect is not earned in a moment," the guard said. "It is something that must be given, not taken lightly. You may think this is a small thing, but it reflects how you see others and how you treat them." Jack stood still, taking in the guard's words. He hadn't expected this encounter to turn into a lesson on respect and responsibility. It felt like the guard was teaching him something important, something he would carry with him. The silence lingered for a moment longer, and then the guard turned away, resuming his position as a sentinel. Jack felt a mixture of relief and lingering discomfort. The guard had not made a scene or raised his voice, but the lesson was clear. Jack had learned something he would never forget. The royal guard slowly turned his back to Jack and his friends, resuming his position as if nothing had happened. His back was straight, his hands clasped in front of him, and his expression was as calm and serious as before. But for Jack, the moment felt far from over. He stood there, staring at the guard, still processing what had just happened. His friends, too, were quiet. No one had expected the situation to unfold like this. What was supposed to be a funny prank had turned into a serious confrontation. The atmosphere around them felt heavy, and Jack's heart was still pounding. He had never been in a situation where something as simple as splashing water could have such a big impact. Jack looked at Sarah, who stood next to him, her face flushed with embarrassment. She wasn't laughing anymore. In fact, she looked downright uncomfortable. "Jack, I told you this wasn't a good idea," she said softly. "We shouldn't have done that. I think we should leave before things get worse." But Jack wasn't ready to just walk away. His pride wouldn't let him. He had started this, and now he needed to finish it. He glanced at the guard again, still standing perfectly still. There was no smile on the guard's face, no sign that he had forgiven them. The royal guard's stern demeanor was enough to remind Jack that this wasn't something to be taken lightly. "I don't think we're in any danger," Jack said, trying to sound confident. But deep down, he knew he had crossed a line. The words the guard had spoken earlier still echoed in his mind. Respect is something that must be given, not taken lightly. Jack realized that he had been selfish. His desire to make his friends laugh had blinded him to the fact that the royal guard wasn't just standing there as a statue or a backdrop for photos. He was a person, a soldier with pride and responsibility. Jack's actions hadn't just been a silly prank. They had disrespected the guard and his role. The silence between them grew, and Jack could feel the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. He had thought it would be funny, but now he realized just how wrong he had been. He had assumed that everyone, including the royal guard, was there for his amusement, but he was mistaken. The guard wasn't part of some performance. He was part of something much larger. He represented tradition, duty, and respect, and Jack had failed to honor that. As the group stood in silence, the guard's stillness became even more powerful. It wasn't the silence of a person who had been caught off guard, but the silence of someone who had seen countless pranks and jokes before, someone who knew how to remain unaffected by them. Jack was starting to understand the power of the guard's presence. It wasn't about being loud or dramatic. It was about standing firm in who you were and what you represented. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jack's voice broke through the silence. "I'm sorry," he said again, this time with more sincerity. "I didn't realize how important your role was. I didn't mean to disrespect you." The guard didn't turn around, but Jack saw his posture shift slightly. He wasn't sure if the guard had heard him or if he was just responding to the change in the air. But for the first time since the prank, Jack felt like the tension between them had eased, even if just a little. Jack's friends slowly began to relax, though none of them dared to laugh or joke about what had happened. They had learned something important too. What seemed like a harmless prank had turned into a lesson on respect, responsibility, and the importance of understanding the people around you. As Jack and his friends walked away from the palace, they were quieter than before. The energy that had been so lighthearted earlier was now filled with reflection. Jack had made a mistake, but he was determined not to forget what he had learned. Respect wasn't something that could be taken for granted. It had to be earned and given to others freely. As Jack and his friends slowly walked away from the royal guard, a heavy silence followed them. They weren't sure what to say or how to act. The excitement they had felt earlier, when Jack had come up with the idea for the prank, was now replaced with a deep sense of discomfort. Jack kept his eyes on the ground, trying to avoid looking at his friends. His thoughts were racing, and a feeling of guilt tugged at him. "I can't believe that just happened," Sarah finally said, breaking the silence. That was intense. Jack glanced at her, his face still flushed with embarrassment. "Yeah," he muttered. "I didn't expect things to go like that." He was still processing the guard's words, the way the guard had looked at him. Calm, serious, but powerful. It wasn't the reaction Jack had imagined at all. He had thought the guard would laugh it off, maybe even get a little annoyed, but not the way he did. The more Jack thought about it, the more he realized how wrong he had been. He had thought of the royal guard as nothing more than a part of the tourist attraction. To Jack, the guard was just a soldier in a uniform, standing still for photos, looking like a living statue. He had never considered that the guard's role was much more important. Now, Jack could feel the weight of his actions pressing down on him. "I was just trying to have a little fun," Jack said quietly, his voice filled with regret. "I didn't think about how serious his job is. I didn't mean to disrespect him." "I know you didn't mean to, Jack," Sarah said, her voice soft. "But sometimes we don't realize the impact our actions can have on others, especially when we don't understand their role or their responsibilities." Jack nodded, her words hitting home. He had seen the royal guards in movies, pictures, and even from a distance during his travels. But never once had he thought about what it meant to stand guard, to be a symbol of duty and tradition. In that moment, he understood just how much respect the guards deserved. They weren't there to entertain tourists. They were there to serve a purpose, and that purpose deserved respect. The group walked in silence for a while, each person lost in their own thoughts. They passed by more tourists, some of them taking photos of the palace and the guards, just as Jack had earlier. But now, Jack looked at the guards with a new perspective. They weren't just part of the scenery. They were standing with pride, representing something much bigger than themselves. Jack felt a knot in his stomach. The prank might have seemed harmless at first, but now it felt disrespectful. He had taken a moment that was supposed to be full of admiration and turned it into something silly. He couldn't shake the image of the guard's serious face and the calm, firm way he had responded. The guard hadn't raised his voice or acted angry. He had simply spoken with authority, showing Jack that respect wasn't something you could just demand from others. It had to be earned. "I think we should apologize," Jack said after a long pause. "Not just to him, but to all the guards. We shouldn't have done that." Sarah nodded in agreement. "I think that's a good idea." Jack turned to the others in the group. They all seemed to agree, though none of them seemed eager to go back to the palace. But Jack knew what he had to do. He needed to make things right, even if it meant admitting he had made a mistake. He owed it to the guard, and to himself. The group turned around and slowly made their way back to where the guard stood. Jack's heart was racing again, but this time, it wasn't from excitement. It was from a deep sense of responsibility. They had done something wrong, and now they had to face the consequences, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. As they approached the palace, Jack took a deep breath, ready to make his apology. As Jack and his friends slowly approached the royal guard again, the air around them felt tense, but also heavy with the weight of their decision to make things right. Jack's heart was still racing. He had no idea how the guard would react to their apology. Would he accept it, or would he remain just as serious and unbothered as before? All Jack knew was that he needed to take responsibility for what he had done. The guard stood exactly as he had before, his posture straight and rigid, his eyes forward, looking over the palace grounds. Jack felt a wave of respect for the man in front of him, realizing how much control and discipline it must take to stand motionless for hours without showing any sign of weakness. The guard wasn't just a statue, as Jack had once thought. He was a person with a purpose, one that required strength and composure. "Excuse me," Jack said, his voice quieter this time. "We wanted to apologize. I didn't mean to disrespect you earlier. It was a silly prank, and I realize now that it was wrong." For a moment, there was no response. Jack held his breath, waiting for the guard to turn around or speak. The silence felt longer than it actually was, but Jack didn't dare speak again until the guard responded. Finally, the guard turned his head slightly toward Jack, just enough to acknowledge him. "You understand why your actions were inappropriate?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. There was no anger in his tone, only a quiet authority. Jack nodded quickly. "Yes, I do," he said, his voice more confident now. "I understand that your role is important, and I should have respected that. I didn't think about how my actions might affect you or what you stand for. I'm sorry." The guard seemed to consider Jack's words for a moment. "It is not just about me," the guard replied slowly. "It is about the respect for what I represent. This uniform, the duty I carry, the history that comes with it. These things deserve respect." Jack nodded again, feeling a little ashamed of his earlier actions. He had thought the guard was just part of the scenery, something to entertain tourists. But now he saw the bigger picture. The guard wasn't just a person in a costume. He was a symbol of something much greater, a tradition that had lasted for generations. "The role of a royal guard is not one of mere appearance," the guard continued, his voice steady. "It is a role of service and honor. We are here not only to protect, but to represent the heritage and values of this place. To disrespect, that is to disregard the hard work and commitment that generations of soldiers have put into protecting the crown and its people." Jack felt a mix of awe and embarrassment wash over him. He had never thought of it this way. The royal guard wasn't just standing there for the sake of tradition. They were standing guard for a purpose that meant far more than he had realized. Their job was not to make tourists laugh or to be a part of a fun moment. It was to carry out a duty that required respect and understanding. "I didn't understand that before," Jack said, his voice sincere. "I thought it was all just a show, but now I see how much it truly means. I'm really sorry for what I did." The guard gave a small nod, as if accepting Jack's apology. "It is important to learn from our mistakes," he said. "What you did was wrong, but the fact that you are willing to understand and apologize shows that you are learning." Jack felt a small sense of relief. He knew he had done something wrong, but hearing the guard acknowledge his apology made him feel that maybe, just maybe, he had taken the first step toward making things right. The guard turned back to face the palace grounds, his expression still serious, but no longer as distant. "Remember, respect is something that must be given freely. It cannot be forced or taken for granted." Jack nodded again, this time feeling a deep appreciation for the guard and the lesson he had learned. As he turned to walk away, he knew that he would never look at a royal guard or anyone in a position of responsibility in the same way again. What had started as a simple prank had taught him a lesson in respect, and he was grateful for that. As Jack and his friends walked away from the royal guard, the tension in the air seemed to lift, but a new feeling lingered, a sense of reflection. Jack walked slowly, his thoughts still on the conversation with the guard. He had learned something important, something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. What had started as a simple prank had turned into a lesson about respect, duty, and the consequences of his actions. His friends, who had been quiet since they apologized, began to speak up. "I'm glad you said something, Jack," Sarah said, her voice soft but supportive. "I think that guard appreciated it. It seemed like he was ready to listen." Jack nodded. But his mind was still racing. "I hope so," he said, his voice full of sincerity. I didn't realize how serious this was. I didn't understand what he was doing, what it all meant. Now I see it differently. The group walked in silence for a moment, each person processing the events in their own way. Jack couldn't shake the image of the guard's serious expression and calm voice. It had been so different from what he had expected. The guard hadn't shouted or gotten angry. He had simply explained why Jack's actions had been disrespectful and taught him a lesson in the process. "I feel bad about it, to be honest," Jack admitted after a few moments. "It was supposed to be a harmless joke, but I see now how disrespectful it was. I can't believe I didn't think about it that way before." "You weren't the only one," Sarah replied. "We all thought it would be funny. But now we know that there's more to those guards than we ever realized. They represent something important. They stand there with purpose, not for our entertainment." Jack took a deep breath. "I think we've all learned something today. I know I have. I'm going to look at people in uniforms, in positions of authority, very differently from now on." His friends agreed. The rest of the walk was quieter than usual, but the air felt calmer, more thoughtful. Jack reflected on how easy it was to forget the value of something until it was challenged. The Royal Guard wasn't there just to be a figurehead. He was a living example of service, discipline, and pride. Jack had thought he was harmlessly splashing water on a statue, but he had underestimated the importance of the guard's role. When they reached the edge of the palace grounds, Jack stopped and turned to his friends. "I'm really sorry for dragging you into that. It wasn't fair to you guys. I didn't realize the full picture, but now I do." His friends smiled at him, understanding. "It's okay, Jack," Sarah said. "We all make mistakes. What matters is that you learned from it. We all did." Jack smiled back, feeling grateful for his friend's understanding. He knew he had made a mistake, but he was determined to make sure it was a lesson he wouldn't forget. He had learned the importance of respect, not just for the Royal Guard, but for everyone in a position of responsibility. As they walked away from the palace, Jack looked back one last time at the Royal Guard, still standing motionless, guarding the gates. He felt a deep sense of respect for the man who had taught him such an important lesson. The guard wasn't just standing there for show. He was standing there to uphold something bigger than himself. Jack's mind was clear now. He had learned a valuable lesson. The next time he encountered someone in a uniform, someone in a position of responsibility, he would remember the Royal Guard's words. Respect is something that must be given freely. It cannot be taken for granted. The sun was beginning to set as Jack and his friends made their way through the streets of London, the excitement of their earlier adventure now replaced with quiet reflection. They had learned an important lesson, one that Jack never expected to gain from a simple joke. What had started as a playful prank on a Royal Guard had turned into a moment of growth, a reminder of how easy it was to forget the value of something until it was challenged. As they walked, the city around them felt different, more alive. Somehow, Jack looked up at the grand buildings, the streets full of people, and realized that he had been taking so many things for granted. He had been so focused on his own amusement that he had never considered how others might feel about his actions. "I think that was the most serious thing I've ever experienced," Jack said, breaking the silence. "I didn't expect it to turn into a life lesson." Sarah smiled, glancing over at him. "I'm glad you learned something. I think we all did. It was a little scary at first, but it was also kind of eye-opening. I never really thought about the role of those guards before. They don't just stand there for decoration. They're doing something meaningful." Jack nodded, feeling a sense of understanding wash over him. "Yeah, I realize now how much respect they deserve. I thought they were just part of the show, but they're there for a much bigger purpose. And I didn't show that respect earlier." "It happens to all of us," Sarah said kindly. "Sometimes we don't realize how our actions affect others until it's too late. But the important thing is that you understand now, Jack. You'll never make that mistake again." Jack smiled, feeling the weight of Sarah's words. It was true. He had learned something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He had thought it would be just a harmless prank, but now he saw that there were consequences to his actions, especially when it came to respecting others and the roles they played. The Royal Guard wasn't just a person in a uniform. He was a symbol of something larger, of history, of duty, and of pride. As the group continued their walk, Jack couldn't help but think about all the other people he might take for granted. From the guards at the palace to the workers in the city, everyone had a role to play, and every role deserved respect. It wasn't about the uniform or the title. It was about the person behind it, doing their job with dedication and pride. When they reached a quiet cafe, Jack turned to his friends. "I really want to thank you all for sticking with me through that. I know it was uncomfortable, but I think we're all better for it." His friends smiled, nodding in agreement. It was definitely a learning experience. One of them said, "I think we all learned something about respect today. It's not just about saying the words. It's about showing it through our actions." Jack couldn't agree more. He had learned that respect wasn't something to take lightly. It had to be earned and given freely, not just when it was convenient, but all the time. He knew that he had to be more mindful of how he treated others from now on, whether they were in a uniform or just people going about their day. As they sat down to enjoy their meal, Jack's mind was calmer, more focused. The day had started with laughter, but it ended with a deeper understanding of the world around him. He was grateful for the lesson he had learned, and he knew it was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The Royal Guard had given him more than just a serious look. He had given Jack a new perspective on respect, duty, and what it meant to truly honor someone's role in the world.